Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're going to do a historical misconceptions video. Hilariously, he has on there that it will be extremely controversial and to be nice in the comments, and so that got my attention immediately. I've done at least one of these videos. I know I did a salmonella one way back when I first started the channel. Um, and it had some pretty good ones on there from, if I remember correctly, Einstein's grades were on there. Um, the slavery in Egypt was on there. I can't remember what else. But it was a pretty good one. Salmonella's hilarious. But I'm curious to see what he has on here. And as far as general historical misconceptions, these are super intriguing to me because most of the time I talk and, you know, get into history with people that really like and focus on history. So there's not a ton of historical misconceptions that come up in those conversations. Every now and then there'll be one, but for the most part, they don't come up. And so these are interesting to me because I'm curious kind of what general misconceptions there are and if there's any that I don't know of or haven't heard of. So, top 11 historical misconceptions. Let's get into it.
I've spent my life stuck in the past. I run a history show, and so it basically goes without saying. And this is unbelievably nerdy, but it's still true. Once you spend enough time in the past and get better at understanding it, it's almost like a foreign country that you learn to like and respect. And so when people try to misconstrue the past, you feel somewhat upset and want to defend your friend.
That's actually a really interesting way to put that. I've never heard it said that way. That's really interesting.
This is why this video exists. This video isn't meant to look at stuff where it's clearly some special interest group involved. Holocaust deniers will continue to deny the Holocaust since they hate Jews. The Turks will continue to deny the Armenian genocide. Indians will continue to hate on Churchill. This video looks at stuff we get wrong in history without even thinking about it, although each of these feeds into a certain narcissism and prejudice inside our current society. These are all sort of controversial claims on my part, so for each claim I'm going to pick one or two books that are the best source to back me up. So to start, number 11, that the commanders in World War I were idiots.
um, I've talked about this on a bunch of different World War One videos. It really depends on who you're reading, on how the different commanders come across from World War One. Yes, the general view is they were not particularly great. However, I've explained before that the way that I view this is this was a brand new type of warfare that nobody knew really how to operate in. And so, how do you figure it out without trial and error? There really isn't a way to do it, right? And when the trial and error cost you lives in the way that World War One battles cost countries lives, it's really easy, and I mean it's really easy, to Monday morning quarterback that thing and say that it should have been done differently or not been done. I will say this. I think there is a line at some point in the war where you could say, I think that by this point, commanders should know better than this, right? However, there tends to be this view that all across the board, start to finish, World War One commanders were pretty garbage. And so yeah, I feel like this is a good one. Let's see what he has to say about it.
You could say I made this list 11 rather than 10 to like going over the top too much. At least here I'm facing internet comments and not machine guns. We sort of have this myth that much of the bloodshed of the battles like the Somme, Ypres, Verdun, etc. were caused by commanders that were completely out of touch with modern technology and incapable of changing their techniques. cold-blooded killers who cared nothing for the piles of bodies they made. There's a couple important variables to keep in mind. The first is that World War I was the first lengthy European war in 99 years, and this was during the era of the greatest technological progress ever. Also, keep in mind this was the first war in which technological progress was an immediately apparent variable. Roughly similar tactics like cavalry charges, musket firing lines, etc. had existed for hundreds or thousands of years, and this was the first major war that had fought dramatically different from that archetype.
And not only that, not only was it different, if you use those tactics, it was mass slaughter. That's the like you learn that real fast at the beginning of World War One. The marching up in columns, the cavalry charges, bayonet charges, that stuff doesn't work anymore. That is going to lead to mass slaughter, right? Because even so, cavalry obviously is used. It's used in a lot of different ways, but historically, if a army broke and began to retreat, you could send the cavalry in to basically go run them all down, right? It's a huge advantage. If you don't have that, you basically are both marching in the same direction at the same speed. Um, so cavalry is good to kind of run down a routing army. But in World War One, even if an army is broken and routing, they could form a line and turn around and fire off bursts with machine guns that just destroy cavalry regiments. And so, yeah, it's not just that the tactics have moved away, which they absolutely have, but it's that the tactics themselves now cost a ton to use them.
This was the first war where armies realized that changing technology was something that had to happen in months rather than decades. Also, it was very unclear what changes would result in a breakthrough. The World War I generals tried a huge amount of things, whether poison gas, extraordinary amounts of artillery fire, blowing enormous craters in the enemy line, infiltration tactics, attacking different geographic regions, and any of these could have broken the Western Front if things went well. No one knew the tank was the thing that would finally end trench warfare. A big issue was that radio was not advanced enough for an army of this era to coordinate offensives in the large regions that were being fought over, and the machine gun and barbed wire made the defensive unbelievably powerful. People often criticize leaders of this era for not ending the war with a peace before all the death, but this ignores the ugly truth that the populations involved were unbelievably bloodthirsty. The start of the war was greeted with joy and excitement, while the massive casualties are seen as a justification for the war, since
People feel the need for a scapegoat, just saying that a war started during a real bad juncture in military technological progress that favored the defensive, while Europe was going through an immense demographic youth bulge that created lots of aggression and energy, isn't very comforting to the millions who suffered in the war. Similarly, after the war, when the adrenaline ran off, people didn't want to admit that they were part of the collective madness of bloodthirstiness that let the war happen. It was easier on both accounts to just blame the leadership. Eh, that's a great book. John Keegan is. That's a great book. I I agree with the sentiment overall. I think that may be putting off a little bit too much onto the general public. There are very specific reasons that World War One commanders are looked poorly on, and you can read them in books just like this John Keegan book. I mean, there are contemporary writers from the time, dozens of them, from countries all across the board, that just tear apart the leadership on the front lines. I think those writings from contemporaries at the time and the general feeling of the frontline soldier that they were not valuable led to much more of the long-term belief that the World War One commanders were bad than just happening to be an easy scapegoat for the populaces of the countries.
National honor demanded revenge and the burning of the enemy capital as retribution for your son's death. Any government that made a peace before the end would have collapsed, either due to losing the election or revolution. Number 10. Oriental Despotism. There's this tendency to view the states coming out of the Middle East as some sort of big red blob that wash over Europe and fight some battle like Salamis, Vienna, Constantinople, or Tours, and then return to their lairs, normally with hordes of peasants being whipped into human waves. In fact, many of the Middle Eastern empires were immensely subtle regimes that could be very nice places to live. The Persian Empire that fought the Greeks was a very tolerant, wealthy, well-run, and developed state.
That is absolutely graded on a curve, right? I've talked about this in the prior video about the Persians. For the time period, they are very lenient, especially if you compare them to their predecessors in the Assyrians. They are ridiculously lenient when you're comparing them to the Assyrians. However, that's graded on a curve. If you read stuff about what they did whenever they were angry, they could be just as bad as the Assyrians were at any given point, right? That's one thing. Second, there are biases that come from Greek writers such as Herodotus that essentially talk of this Oriental decadence, and I've talked about how sometimes Persian women will be used to kind of like demasculate Persian men in Greek writings. Um, it's just bias, right? All ancient history has this. You really have to parse out what is what in ancient history, because you get all those biases, you get the incredible slant of, whoever you're reading from the time. And so historians just have to be able to go through and parse it out. I will give him, though, those biases absolutely do exist. And if you are grading on that curve, the Persian Empire is pretty dang lenient for the time period.
By every metric except intellectual ferment, the Persian Empire would be the first world, and the Greeks were a second world backwater. There were many equally pleasant, humane Middle Eastern regimes like the Abbasids, Umayyads, and Parthians. In the 16th century, you could easily claim that the prosperous, fairly tolerant, relatively free, and vast Ottoman Empire would be the best place in the world to live. Meanwhile, Western Europe was
Depending on who you were.
going through internal strife, religious war, and witch burnings. Similarly, Islam in the early Middle
Yeah, it was not a good time in Europe.
Ages was the most technologically advanced area in the world. The Islamic world, even though having a much less scientific worldview than the West, had rough technological parity until around 1700. These Near Eastern empires are often viewed as static blobs, but nothing could be further from the truth. Number 9. Dialogue. This is sort of different from the rest of the list in that most of it comes with our portrayals of the past in stuff like TV, literature, and video games. The way people in the past talk and socially interact is very off. The big thing to consider is that people in the past lived in social hierarchies that were way more steep than what we have today. In portrayals of the past, class is never looked at. In most historic societies, social superiors were slavishly praised and never corrected, while inferiors are treated with immense condescension or just flat-out rudeness. Classes could interact with each other, but their roles were quite prescribed. Also, we ignore stuff that was very important to people in many pre-modern cultures, such as religion and honor. A big reason for this is the current cultural powerhouse of the world is the United States, which in history is very much the exception by having an incredibly weak class structure. Similarly, American English is the most direct style of talking there is in the world. Read Victorian or Georgian novels and see the way they talk. Much more is conveyed by insinuation and subtlety rather than directly. You see similar stuff in a lot of world cultures today like China or Mexico, that have stronger class structures and more recent industrialization. Similarly, swearing is really off. People swear way too much and incorrectly. Fuck and shit were not swear words in the Middle Ages. In societies with no privacy, they couldn't afford it. Instead, stuff like God's bones was, and in Quebecois French, you still swear by naming articles in a church like tabernacle. Similarly, people really swore much less before 40 years ago, and so putting casual swearing in a genteel environment in the 1920s just isn't plausible. Another sort of related but interesting thing is accent. I speak two languages, French and English. In period pieces, both languages get accent wrong. Before the 19th century, British English had a hard R and sounded like a combination of a pirate and an American accent, but for the royalty and nobility, more like a southern plantation accent. Similarly, the earlier French accent is much closer to French Canadian than a modern Parisian one. I
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
could go on, but I'm sure you get the point. Number 8. That people in the past were stupid and immoral. No one will directly say this, but it exists in a lot of assumptions we have in our society. We assume that people in the past were dumb for believing in demons or cruel for having brutal public punishments. We blame one historical figure or another for not coming up to our current moral standards. It would take thousands of pages for me to go through every example, but let me get through the ones I just mentioned and one more. Ancient peoples believed evil spirits could infect food and parts of the natural world, and once an evil spirit infected someone, their mind or body would weaken. When you realize that
That doesn't seem that crazy to me. Those are the kind of things where I'm like, okay, but they don't understand where certain illnesses are coming from or how certain things are happening. So that actually seems like I don't see that at all as dumb. I see that as like a rationalization to the logical conclusion of their worldview. Right? Does that make sense? Although we do, as a modern day society, we absolutely do talk about some of the people of the past in this way.
you could get evil spirits out of fruit by cooking it, you realize this is a society struggling to understand disease
Yep.
without the technology to see germs. Similarly, when you don't have the ability to get medicine that can help, the placebo of magical medicine does actually statistically help. Similarly, in medieval societies which had very high crime and murder rates, and which didn't have the resources to maintain jails and had precious little law enforcement, the law was enforced by brutal punishments to those they happened to catch to make as good an incentive as possible against crime. Finally, it's easy to criticize pre-modern societies for their massive inequality, sexism, steep class divisions, and systems of bondage like slavery or serfdom, until you realize that every single advanced society
Sorry, I was just reading through it real quick. Um, yeah, this is just one of those things. It depends on where you are. It depends on the time period. It depends on the religion and cultural identity and belief system and class. Like, it depends on a lot of different things, right? But I don't know why we look at the past that way. Look around the world today. There's shitty places and things everywhere, right? So 100 years from now, 200 years from now, we'll be judged on the exact same scale that we do the past. So
society in pre-modern times had them to a differing degree, and then you start to realize that it was probably necessary for them to function. When your average individual productivity is super low, you need to oppress a lot of people to accomplish anything important. Similarly, in a world where the only power is muscle, slavery or serfdom is the way to accomplish necessary yet unpleasant tasks. This type of thinking is a rabbit hole that can go on forever. I recommend you check out the book Foragers, Farmers, and Fossil Fuels, which is a really good summary of this.
huh.
Number 7. Industrialization was awful. There's sort of this belief
Jesus, Jesus. If this is a belief you hold that industrialization was awful, go read what the average person's life was like pre-industrialization, and then read what the average person's life was like, 20 years, then 50 years, then 100 years after industrialization. It's everything has its shortcomings. Nothing is perfect. But the world drastically changed with modernization and industrialization.
Belief that the early stages of industrialization were that of horrifying exploitation, in which factory workers toiled for 16-hour days in terrible conditions while the owners grew rich. There is some element of truth to this, although in many circumstances the worst conditions are cherry-picked for political agendas. However, industrialization was much better than what came before it. There's this really interesting part of the 1854 Elizabeth Gaskell novel, North and South, where our lead character is visiting the home of a North English working-class family and sees they live much better than the rural South English peasantry. Being able to eat meat every day and having good furniture while only working 10-hour days. Similar to China, where people will literally illegally migrate to the big cities in order to work 12-hour days in terrible housing just to get away from the fields. We tend to glorify traditional agriculture, but it's really horrifyingly bad.
Yep.
People work themselves from sunup till sundown until their backs break, while worrying about putting food on the table with each harvest. This is why wherever industrialization has occurred, people have fled en masse to the cities to work in the factories. However, on the other hand, a big factor people tend to miss out of industrialization is the psychological stress. Cases of insanity skyrocketed in 19th century Britain to unprecedented levels as the traditional village life of millennia got tore apart in a generation.
Marxists need to make 19th century industrialism look terrible to justify their existence, because if it wasn't, that would just make them whiners. Similar processes occur with the demonization of Tsarist Russia, Batista's Cuba, Chiang Kai-shek, all of which were significantly more benign than the communist regimes that came afterwards. A certain percentage of the population will always distrust technological progress, and always has. Yeah, like I said, read what the average person's life was like pre-industrialization, post-industrialization. It's night and day different, right? History from start to finish is one big shit show, right? There's blood and gore and terrible things happening all the time and everywhere, but you have to put things into context. You know, everything is not equal. And so when you compare it post-industrialization to pre-industrialization, there really is no no comparison. It's I mean the evidence speaks for itself.
Similarly, China is currently experiencing their version of the Roaring Twenties to deal with the side effects of their industrialization.
They're struggling a little bit now.
Number 6. The Europeans exploited Africa. Boy, this one's going to be controversial.
Holy shit, I can't believe he's saying this one. I cannot believe he's doing this one.
There's this mistaken belief that the Europeans went into Africa, raped the continent, and then left. If we're counting the Atlantic slave trade, that's true, but I'm referring here to the European colonization of Africa in the late 19th and 20th centuries, which was a very different situation. Just look at Britain's investments at the turn of the 20th century. 40% were in Britain itself. Another 45% were in the USA, South America, and continental Europe, with France being the biggest trade partner. Only around 15% were in the actual British Empire, of which the White Dominions and India were the biggest partners. Meanwhile, Africa made up less than 2%. Nearly every African colony cost the Europeans far more than they got out of it. The Europeans didn't even colonize Africa for money. The Industrial Revolution created such a technological barrier, and the Europeans in general just bribed local chieftains, that the Europeans colonized Africa mostly for pride. The French did it to get some pride after the Franco-Prussian War. The British were worried the French would get too powerful, so got involved, and then the Germans and Italians didn't want to be left out. The Europeans got a lot of flack for having most of their African budgets being in military and administration, but remember, in most of Africa there was no pre-existing state apparatus, and without a functioning state, education and health really don't matter. However, Europe invested far more into Africa than it ever got out, which it's difficult to describe as exploitation. I'm not saying the Europeans were good guys. They were brutally racist and often cruel. They would have exploited Africa if they could, but there really wasn't enough to steal to offset the costs involved. I'm not even sure how much effect the Europeans themselves had on Africa. For the 60 years they were there, by the time the Europeans decolonized the average African colony, it had about 10,000 Europeans, and 60% of the continent was still animist. The Europeans worked through local African elites whenever possible. Very few Africans saw a European, were involved in the European economic system, or saw the printed word before 1950. Number 5. Early civilization.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm keeping my mouth shut on that one.
Civilizations were good places. I feel like everyone when they're 13 gets fed the diet of school education talking about ancient Egypt and Sumer. We always get this sort of pleasant view of them. We're never told these were absolutely terrible places to live. I talk a lot in this show about how frontier societies can either develop towards servitude or freedom. The early civilizations were very much frontier servitude societies. Civilization wasn't formed willingly in the greater Middle East. Instead, a drying climate combined with high population density demanded cooperation over irrigation to survive.
If you're looking for nice places to live in the ancient world, they are very few and far between, and none of them are going to be nice by today's standards.
Control over the irrigation canals meant that leaders could just cut off the water to dissenters, so freedom was a joke. All the regimes involved tried to maintain control over their populations to maintain their irrigation canals, which was brutal work. Egypt was a caste society. Sumer was a slave one. Many of Sumer's wars were fought explicitly to gain slaves, which were about 20% of the population. By the end of the Babylonian Empire, 3/4 of the population were slaves. Many of the walls in this region existed to keep the population in rather than barbarians out. India's caste system was formed in this era for similar reasons. Similarly, these early civilizations were terribly weak. Mesopotamia was more often than not ruled by some foreign barbarian dynasty, while Middle Kingdom Egypt was defeated by barbarians who used bronze weapons and the bow and arrow. Barbarians had better lives and were better fighters. Similarly, these early civilizations get a lot of credit for inventing things, but remember, they had 4,000 years to do it, and a lot of the inventions we attribute to Egypt and Sumer were really invented elsewhere. For example, bronze and iron working were invented in the Caucasus, and the wheel was invented in modern-day Ukraine. Number 4. The Dark Ages were really terrible. We treat the fall of Rome like it's a bad thing, but by the empire fell, it was a parasitic, authoritarian organization. In fact, in North Africa, England, and France, the standard of living and quality of goods actually rose under the barbarians. After the fall of Rome, urbanization and construction collapsed in Western Europe. We view this as a bad thing since we don't understand the Roman Empire was trying to support an urban civilization despite a level of agricultural productivity that simply shouldn't have been supporting it in Western Europe. So when Rome stopped making the administrative and social incentives for cities, they just went away. This was actually better for the average peasant who stopped having an absentee landlord to tell them what to do and take taxes. The healthiest and tallest people, alongside probably the freest in Europe between the birth of Christ and the Industrial Revolution, were in the centuries after the fall of Rome. Actually, in per capita income, in the worst years of the Dark Ages, the average Western European was only 7% poorer than a Chinese, which was the wealthiest civilization in the world. However, the good plows...
That's not a great comparison, though. Comparing it to China. This whole argument is a little bit strange to me. Because he's essentially taking very, very specific criteria and kind of building an argument that I'm not really sure is legitimate out of the criteria that he's pulling from. I don't know. Let me listen to what the rest he has to say.
That could till Northern Europe's soil were not invented yet, so the population density inside Western Europe was tiny. So for individuals, it was pretty good, but the collective European civilization did not progress much. Number 3.
Yeah, so I'm confused about what the argument is there. Is the argument that it's better? Like, okay, so here's the deal. The way that history works is that if the society is weak, it will be taken. Like, there really is no wiggle room there unless you were like so geographically, a black swan that nobody can get to you or that it's extremely difficult to get to you. The whole point of having a society and a strong society is so that some random group can't just come in and overthrow everything and then you become part of one of these slave systems or the bottom level of one of these caste systems. So to make the argument that there was less of a society and so therefore there was a higher standard of living, it's like, yeah, but to what extent? Like, to what extent was the higher standard of living and how long did it last in what area? Right? Because if somebody comes in and takes all your stuff and throws you into slavery because there is no society, was that better for your life expectancy? Like, did you live a better life in that regard? I don't know. That one was just a weird argument to me.
The Middle Ages were primitive.
I hate the word primitive. You could make the argument all of history is primitive. You could make the argument that we're primitive today. So I'm not sure where this one's going to go, but I just don't. The word primitive kind of bothers me in the context that it's normally used.
People confuse the Dark Ages and Middle Ages a lot, which is just dumb. In the Dark Ages around 700, Europe was a backwater. Well, by the time we hit the Black Death in 1336, Europe might have been the most developed area in the world. In the Dark Ages, Europe was making wooden huts. In the Middle Ages, Gothic cathedrals. We have a very biased view of the Middle Ages, viewing it as some horrifying primitive shithole. Let me just list some surprisingly modern things that existed in the Middle Ages. A banking system, governmental fiscal policies, paper checks, universities.
Okay, so let's see here. Banking is sort of an interesting thing here, and even more interesting when the church gets involved because of the church's stance on interest. Um, let's see. Financial crash. The King of England refused to honor his debts and blew up the Italian financial system. Government fiscal policies. Everyone was trying to purposely inflate their currencies. Paper checks used by Templars. Universities. Yeah, universities was a big deal. I actually took a class on that, on early universities when I was in university. Um, Rationality versus internet, irrationality, stock market, government bureaucracies, historians, flying machine. Uh, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Are any of these like. I guess if you have the mindset that literally nothing was going on, then this probably looks like a crazy list. So I guess if that really is a big misconception that people have, this is probably super surprising. But I mean, like I said, you could make this argument for any time period, even the current time period, that it's terrible, that it's primitive, that it's, that's just that argument could be made at any point in history.
Intellectual debate, a stock market, government bureaucracies, a publishing industry, historians, flying machines, and public atheism.
A lot of these are weird to me. That was a weird list to make. Intellectual debates, like, I don't know, Greek philosophers have been around for forever. Um, I don't know, just that whole list was a little bit weird to me.
We view the Middle Ages as some stagnant pool of regression, but by every metric, and as I've said before in this show, medieval Christendom was one of the most inventive societies ever. From 1100 to 1300, Europe saw immense advances in naval, military, medical, literary, political, philosophic, mechanical,
Um, yeah, God, look at that. That's a big old drop.
demographic, and architectural fields. Compared to any civilization except the modern West, medieval Europe abounded in creativity. Another thing, before the Black Death, the Catholic Church took the line that bathing was healthy and should be done daily, and that belief in witchcraft was a superstition that marked you out as a fool. Funnily, as Europe left the Middle Ages and entered the Renaissance, bathing declined while belief in witchcraft grew. Number 2, migrations never occurred. This is a strange belief in modern archaeology. Whenever they see a change in culture in the archaeology, it's just naturally assumed to be a peaceful shift in culture rather than a migration or invasion. I always found this a bit strange since recorded history is filled to the brim with both. Genetics has really ripped this theory apart. Genetics has shown that massive migrations and shifts have taken place in history, especially before written records. Entire races have been wiped off the face of the earth. Africa south of Cameroon, South and East Asia, Central Asia, Europe, and parts of the Americas were all inhabited by people 10,000 years ago that have practically no descendants now. This is why the inhabitants of Britain and Scandinavia 9,000 years ago had dark skin from looking at genetics, or why you see very European-looking North Americans from this same era, since those races are just gone now. The modern inhabitants of Northern Europe, for example, came mostly out of Central Asia around 5,000 years ago, committing genocide against the previous inhabitants.
So is the argument that that doesn't happen, that their mass migration is not a thing? I'm confused about what the misconception is here. That doesn't if either way, if it's mass migration isn't a thing or that it's the only thing, both of those wouldn't. I'm just confused. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody make this argument before of about mass migration not being not being a thing.
You see similarly shocking results in historic times. The population of England is likely 40% Germanic, since a small group of Saxon males killed off the native Celtic male population and married the females. Similarly few of the indigenous inhabitants of the Balkans or Eastern Europe were left after the Slavs arrived. It gets even crazier the further you go back into history, where it suggests that humans aren't even entirely from Africa, having moved several times between Africa and Asia, while at least 2 whole new human species have been discovered.
Okay, let's see the myth. The reason for the myth, the previous correct 19th century paradigm that migrations and genocides were common in history, was used as a justification for colonialism in the Nazis' post-World War II academia, thus became allergic to the theory and did everything it could to avoid it, even if it verged upon ridiculous at times. 2. Lots of political causes and dependent upon people being in the land they're currently living in since time immemorial. Okay, so the idea is that everybody's been in the same spot for forever. Is that what it is? Um, I don't know. That seems crazy to me. Is this a thing? Is this a misconception that people have? I don't know. There's migrations and genocides literally I mean, they're not even the most recent ones weren't even that long ago. So this just seems like a wild argument to me.
Just due to evidence of them breeding with us in our genomes. Number 1. The Native Americans were hippies. There's this
These last few have been wild. I have not the last few have been ones that I have not heard before.
misconception that the Native Americans were inherently peaceful and in tune with nature.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. So the idea that they were inherently peaceful is one that is, especially in the United States, is pretty common, right? That's something that's In fact, I had a big back and forth blow up one time with a psychology teacher who, in one way or another, got sidetracked into this conversation about Native American history that she did not have a very good grasp of. Um, and this is how the whole conversation, from her point of view, was portrayed, was of this idea of an overtly peaceful living off the land and living together idea of almost like a centralized united Native American group. Yeah, that shit was not happening. Like that is that's not the case, right? Like history is full of things that like we might wish were different, but it doesn't actually change the history of it, right? Like it is what it is. That's I don't know. We have a very kind of bad habit of bending history to kind of fit whatever view the current culture or society or even individual person has. Um, but that's not the reality, right? The reality is things happened a certain way, and it is what it is, and that's why I love the archaeology of history. The archaeological evidence is the thing that is so interesting to me because we could have this really solid belief system and foundational view of a historical time period, and we could find one tiny piece of archaeological evidence that just blows that whole thing apart, right? Everything we thought about it is just totally washed away by this one tiny archaeological discovery. It's why I love it so much. It's we're always learning, we're always, figuring out new stuff. But the purposeful misinterpretation, it bothers me a little bit, not just of this, but just in general across the board, right? I have these conversations a lot, and the purposeful misinterpretations are a little bit aggravating.
This is wrong on practically every level. Furthermore, there's this belief that native warfare was mostly ceremonial, which is wrong again. Firstly, on the war section, native peoples killed each other like any other group, and actually had much higher deaths in war as a percent of the population than any European nation. The Iroquois committed genocide against the entire upper Midwest, depopulating a region stretching from Pennsylvania to Missouri. Archaeology suggests that the urban Mississippians were fighting a losing war against the tribes of the Great Plains in the late Middle Ages, with evidence of burned cities and massacres. The Aztecs institutionalized wars with their subject states just to collect captives for the 2 million they sacrificed for their gods. Something else people often forget is that even in what would become the United States, the Native Americans weren't all forest tribes. You had some very developed urban societies. On the environmental front, the natives were actually worse than the Europeans, since the Europeans could rely on a wider range of crops and animals that prevented the land from being overused. Both the Aztec and Inca empires were facing environmental degradation to a certain degree. The American southwestern mountains used to be covered in trees, but the local Pueblo peoples deforested them. In the eastern United States, the natives purposely manipulated and burned the environment to make it as fertile as possible. I'm not trying to justify the European colonization here, but I want to make clear that the Native Americans were people like any other, subject to the same flaws and good traits as anyone else, not in some special moral category.
Let's see. Plague hit the native people that wiped out 90% of the populations, thus creating inaccurate pictures of what Native American society was like before the Europeans. There has been a strong self-loathing strand in Western thought since World War I, which is manifested in glorifying the Native Americans. That is absolutely true. There are so few Native Americans left in North America that it's been convenient to use them as a symbol for whatever cause you believe in, rather than as actual individuals, which they would be if they were a larger group. Um, yeah, there's the Native Americans are not very well understood by the vast majority of the population, and and I feel like it's academically taught wrong in a lot of situations because of the that Western self-loathing thing is for sure there. It's for sure there. It's a you know it's a part of it. If you don't live in the U.S., I can assure you it's a pretty big thing here.
Well, that's it. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay.
Okay, so that's it. I'm curious what everybody thinks about this. Particularly, there's a couple in there that I'm interested in, but I really want to know what people think about the fall of the Romans. The idea that Europe was actually better off right after the fall of Rome. Um, I don't know. That one was I was not expecting that one. Um, but yeah, good video. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I'll put the Discord link in the description box down below, and I'll see you all next time.